The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling parking lot of Westfield Shopping Center in Los Angeles. Among the sea of gleaming SUVs, luxury sedans, and pristine sports cars sat a weathered 1995 Honda Civic, its paint faded and small dents telling stories of years of faithful service. What shoppers passing by couldn't have imagined was that behind the wheel of this humble vehicle sat one of Hollywood's most beloved actors. He wore a simple black t-shirt, well-worn jeans, and scuffed motorcycle boots, nothing that would turn heads or suggest wealth beyond measure. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and a few days' worth of stubble covered his jaw. To any casual observer, he looked like just another guy running weekend errands, perhaps a mechanic on his day off, or a construction worker grabbing groceries. But what happened next in that ordinary parking lot would leave everyone completely speechless and remind us all that true character isn't measured by what we own, but by how we treat others when we think nobody important is watching. As our story unfolds, let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Stories like this remind us that kindness and courage can appear in the most unexpected places. And if you enjoy tales that restore your faith in humanity, make sure to subscribe. We'll have another incredible story for you tomorrow. The calm before the storm. The shopping center buzzed with typical Saturday afternoon energy. Families pushed loaded carts toward their cars, teenagers clustered around the food court entrance, and the distant hum of traffic mixed with snippets of conversation in a dozen languages. It was the kind of busy, anonymous atmosphere where people focused on their own tasks, rarely paying attention to the dramas unfolding around them. Near the grocery store entrance, an elderly woman named Martha slowly made her way across the asphalt. At 78, every step required careful consideration. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and she wore a pale blue cardigan over a simple dress, the kind of outfit that spoke of dignity maintained despite modest means. In her weathered hands, she clutched a short grocery list and a small leather purse that had seen better decades. Martha had been coming to this shopping center for over 20 years, ever since her husband Harold passed away, and she'd had to learn to navigate the world on her own. Today's trip was typical: milk, bread, cat food for her tabby whiskers, and maybe a small treat if her pension check had stretched far enough this month. The man watching her from across the parking lot presented a stark contrast to Martha's quiet dignity. Jake Rodriguez had arrived on a rumbling Harley-Davidson, all chrome and attitude. At 35, he was built like a linebacker, with arms covered in elaborate tattoos and a leather vest that proclaimed his membership in a local motorcycle club. His presence demanded attention, and he knew it. But sitting quietly in his faded Honda, observing the scene with the patient stillness of someone who had learned to truly see the world around him, was our unnamed observer. He'd finished his own shopping, just some basic supplies and groceries, and was about to leave when something in the developing scene caught his attention. The predator spots his prey. Jake had been having a rough week. A recent breakup, mounting bills, and a general sense that life wasn't delivering the respect he deserved had left him looking for someone to take his frustrations out on. As he surveyed the parking lot, his eyes settled on Martha, and a cruel smile spread across his face. To Jake, the elderly woman represented everything he found irritating about the world: weakness, slowness, and the burden of accommodating those who couldn't keep up. In his mind, her careful movements were an inconvenience, her age a sign of irrelevance. He saw an easy target for the kind of casual cruelty that made him feel powerful. "Perfect," he muttered to himself, dismounting his bike with deliberate theatricality. Several nearby shoppers glanced his way, some with admiration for the impressive motorcycle, others with wariness at his intimidating appearance. Jake fed off both reactions. From his unobtrusive position, the man in the Honda felt a familiar tension in his chest. He'd encountered this type of situation before, both in his personal life and in the roles he'd played on screen. There was something about witnessing the strong targeting the vulnerable that activated a deep, protective instinct within him. He made no move to intervene yet, but his attention was now fully focused on the unfolding scene. His hands remained relaxed on the steering wheel, but his eyes never left the interaction that was about to begin. The first strike. Jake strutted across the parking lot with the exaggerated swagger of someone performing for an invisible audience. As he approached Martha, who was slowly making her way toward the store entrance, he deliberately stepped into her path. "Whoa there, Grandma," Jake said loudly, his voice carrying across the nearby area. "You sure you should be out here moving so slow? People got places to be." Martha looked up, startled. At her age, unexpected confrontations were particularly jarring. "I'm sorry, dear," she said politely, attempting to step around him. "I'll get out of your way." But Jake sidestepped to block her again, clearly enjoying himself. Nah, I'm trying to help you understand something here. See, this parking lot's got a flow to it, and when people like you clog it up, it affects everyone else." A few shoppers nearby began to notice the interaction. Some looked uncomfortable, but continued walking, following the modern instinct to avoid getting involved. Others slowed their pace, sensing something wrong but uncertain how to respond. From his car, the quiet observer felt his jaw tighten slightly. He'd spent years studying human behavior for his craft, and he recognized the particular kind of person Jake was, someone who compensated for his own insecurities by diminishing others. The performance was just beginning. Martha, despite her age and small stature, had lived through enough to recognize a bully when she saw one. "Young man," she said with the kind of dignity that comes from decades of facing life's challenges, "I'm just trying to get my groceries. I'm not bothering anyone." Jake laughed, but it was the harsh sound of someone who found cruelty amusing. "Not bothering anyone? Lady, just existing at your speed bothers people. Maybe it's time to consider staying home, letting the rest of us live our lives." Escalating cruelty. What had started as casual harassment was escalating into something more disturbing. Jake seemed to be feeding off Martha's obvious discomfort, and the presence of witnesses only emboldened him. "Tell you what, Grandma," Jake continued, his voice getting louder. "How about I time you walking to that store entrance? I'm betting a decent person could make that trip in about 30 seconds. Let's see how long it takes someone who should probably be in a home somewhere." Martha's face flushed with embarrassment and growing fear. This wasn't just rudeness, this was deliberate humiliation. She glanced around hopefully, looking for someone who might intervene, but most people were hurrying past with the practiced indifference of urban life. "Please," she said quietly, "I just want to buy my groceries and go home." "Oh, you want to go home?" Jake's grin became more predatory. "Great idea. How about you turn around right now and head back to whatever senior living situation you crawled out of? Save everyone the trouble of watching you stumble around in there for an hour trying to find the cereal aisle." The cruelty in his words was breathtaking. Several shoppers had now stopped completely, forming a loose circle of witnesses who were clearly uncomfortable but seemed paralyzed by the social awkwardness of the situation. In his car, the man who had been quietly observing felt something shift inside him. He'd always been drawn to roles that explored the nature of heroism, not the flashy, CGI-enhanced kind, but the quiet courage of ordinary people who choose to do what's right when it would be easier to look away. His hand moved to the door handle. The moral crossroads. "Look at all these people watching," Jake announced, gesturing to the growing audience. "You see that, lady? That's embarrassment. That's what happens when you inflict yourself on people who have better things to do." Martha's eyes were beginning to well with tears, but she maintained her composure with the kind of grace that spoke to a lifetime of dignity in the face of hardship. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing wrong." Jake's voice rose to a near shout. "You exist wrong. You move wrong. You probably shop wrong, drive wrong, and live wrong. The world's moved on, Grandma. Time for you to get the memo." It was at this moment that several things happened simultaneously. A few of the witnessing shoppers began to look genuinely distressed, torn between their desire to help and their fear of confronting someone so obviously aggressive. A store security guard, still inside the building, was being alerted to the situation, and in the faded Honda Civic, a decision was being made. The car door opened with a soft click. The man who emerged moved with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are without needing to prove it to anyone. He wasn't tall or imposing in the traditional sense, but there was something in his bearing, a stillness, a centered quality, that immediately drew attention. He walked toward the confrontation with measured steps, his expression calm but focused. To the gathering crowd, he looked like any other concerned citizen deciding to get involved. But his approach was different from what most people might expect from a good Samaritan. Instead of immediately confronting Jake or rushing to Martha's defense, he positioned himself slightly to the side, close enough to intervene if necessary, but not directly challenging the aggressor. It was the movement of someone who understood that de-escalation often required patience and strategy rather than confrontation. The unlikely hero emerges. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying clearly but without aggression. There was something in his tone, a quality of absolute calm, that immediately shifted the dynamic of the scene. Jake turned, ready to deal with another obstacle to his entertainment, but something in the stranger's demeanor gave him pause. This wasn't the nervous intervention of a typical Good Samaritan. This was someone who seemed genuinely unperturbed by Jake's intimidating presence. "Yeah?" Jake said, though with less of the swagger he'd been displaying toward Martha. "You got something to say?" "I was just wondering," the stranger said, speaking as if they were having a casual conversation, "what you're hoping to accomplish here." It was such an unexpected question that Jake was momentarily thrown off balance. "Accomplish? I'm trying to educate this old lady about consideration for others." "Ah," the stranger nodded thoughtfully. "And how's that working out for you?" The question was asked with such genuine curiosity that Jake found himself actually considering it for a moment before his defensiveness kicked back in. "It's working fine. Maybe you should mind your own business." The stranger smiled slightly, not mockingly, but with the kind of patient understanding usually reserved for children having tantrums. "You know, I've always found that the way we treat people who can't do anything for us says a lot about who we really are." Martha, who had been watching this exchange with a mixture of relief and apprehension, found herself studying this unexpected defender. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't quite place it. Wisdom in the face of aggression. Jake was beginning to realize that this intervention wasn't going according to any script he was familiar with. Usually when people confronted him, it led to either backing down or escalating to conflict. But this stranger seemed to be operating from an entirely different playbook. "Look, buddy," Jake said, trying to regain control of the situation. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is between me and Grandma here." "Actually," the stranger said, still in that same calm tone, "I think it's between you and the kind of person you want to be." The profundity of the statement seemed to hang in the air. Several of the watching shoppers found themselves leaning in, drawn by the unexpected depth of the conversation. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jake demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier aggression. "Well," the stranger said, "I'm guessing you're probably a decent guy most of the time. Maybe you work hard, care about your friends, love your family, but right now, you're choosing to be someone else. Someone who finds entertainment in making a grandmother feel ashamed for existing." The accuracy of the assessment was startling. Jake did work hard. He was a mechanic at a local garage. He did care about his motorcycle club brothers, and his mother, who was only 15 years younger than Martha, would be horrified to see him behaving this way. "You don't know anything about me," Jake said, but the protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You're right," the stranger agreed. "But I know something about what it feels like to be angry at the world and looking for someone to blame. The question is this really helping with that anger, or is it just making you into someone you don't actually want to be?" The power of genuine connection. Martha, who had been silent during this exchange, found her voice again. "Young man," she said to the stranger, "thank you for your kindness, but you don't need to put yourself at risk for me." The stranger turned to her with the kind of warm smile that seemed to light up his entire face. "Ma'am, I don't think helping someone is ever a risk. It's just the right thing to do." Something in that smile triggered Martha's memory. She'd seen that exact expression before, in a dozen different movies, in countless interviews, in photos that had graced magazine covers for decades. Her eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. But she said nothing, understanding instinctively that revealing his identity might change the entire dynamic of what was happening. Jake, meanwhile, was struggling with emotions he hadn't expected to feel. The stranger's words had hit uncomfortably close to home. He was angry at his ex-girlfriend, at his financial struggles, at a world that seemed to offer him little respect despite his hard work. And yes, he had been taking it out on someone who didn't deserve it. "Look," Jake said, his voice noticeably softer, "maybe I came on a little strong, but people need to understand that actions have consequences." "They do," the stranger agreed. "And the consequences of how we treat people when they're vulnerable, that says everything about our character." He paused, then continued with the kind of gentle wisdom that comes from years of observing human nature. "You seem like someone who's been having a tough time lately. I get that. Life can be incredibly frustrating, especially when you're working hard and feel like you're not getting the recognition you deserve." Jake's defenses crumbled a little more. It was as if this stranger could see right through him. "But here's the thing," the stranger continued. "Taking that frustration out on someone like this lovely lady doesn't actually make you feel better. It just makes you feel worse about yourself, even if you don't want to admit it." The moment of truth. As the conversation continued, more shoppers had gathered, drawn by the unusual nature of what they were witnessing. This wasn't a typical confrontation or rescue. It was something deeper, more genuine. A teenage employee from the grocery store, who had been watching from the entrance, suddenly gasped audibly. She pulled out her phone, not to record, but to check something. Her eyes went wide as she confirmed what she thought she'd recognized. "Oh my God," she whispered to her coworker. "Do you know who that is?" But the man continued speaking to Jake, as if he were completely unaware of the growing recognition around him. "I've learned something over the years," he said. "Real strength, the kind that actually matters, it shows up in how we treat people who can't fight back, how we handle ourselves when we think nobody important is watching." Jake was quiet now, really listening for the first time. Something about the stranger's presence was having an effect he couldn't quite understand. It wasn't intimidation. The guy wasn't trying to dominate him. It was something else, something that made Jake want to be better than he was being. "The truth is," the stranger continued, "we're all struggling with something. We're all carrying burdens that other people can't see. But that's exactly why we need to be kinder to each other, not crueler." He gestured gently toward Martha. "This lady has probably lived through more challenges, losses, and heartbreaks than any of us can imagine. She's earned the right to buy her groceries in peace, don't you think?" Recognition and reflection. It was at this moment that someone in the crowd couldn't contain themselves any longer. "Excuse me," said a middle-aged woman holding a shopping bag, "aren't you?" But the stranger held up a gentle hand, smiling. "Just someone who believes in treating people with kindness," he said. However, the damage was done. The name began to ripple through the gathered crowd in whispers. "Keanu Reeves, that's Keanu Reeves. Oh my God, it's really him." Jake's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, recognition, and then a dawning horror as he realized he'd been harassing an elderly woman in front of one of the most beloved actors in Hollywood. But more than that, he was processing the fact that this incredibly famous, wealthy person had addressed him with more respect and genuine care than he'd shown to a grandmother. Martha, meanwhile, looked at her defender with new understanding. She'd suspected, but now she was certain. And yet, he'd never used his fame as a weapon or a shield. He'd simply been kind, person to person. I didn't realize," Jake stammered, his whole demeanor changing. "It doesn't matter who I am," Keanu said gently. "What matters is who you are, and I can tell you're a better person than you were being a few minutes ago." The transformation. Jake looked at Martha, really looked at her for the first time. He saw not a target for his frustration, but a human being, a woman who reminded him, uncomfortably, of his own grandmother, the one who had raised him after his parents died, who had worked multiple jobs to keep him fed and clothed, who had never once made him feel like a burden despite her own struggles. "Ma'am," he said to Martha, his voice completely different now, "I owe you an apology. A big one." Martha studied his face, seeing genuine remorse there. "We all have bad days, dear," she said quietly. "No," Jake shook his head. This wasn't about having a bad day. This was about me being cruel because I thought I could get away with it, because I thought it might make me feel better somehow. He paused, swallowing hard. It didn't. It just made me feel like a coward. The crowd around them had grown, but it wasn't the typical celebrity mob scene. People were genuinely moved by what they were witnessing, a real moment of human connection and growth. Keanu placed a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. The fact that you can recognize that, the fact that you can change course, that takes real courage. That's actually the strongest thing you could do right now. Jake nodded, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. How do I make this right? You just did, Martha said softly. A sincere apology takes strength, young man. But Keanu had another idea. Actually, he said, I think there might be something else you could do. Acts of redemption. Mrs. Keanu looked to Martha. Thompson, she supplied. Martha Thompson. Mrs. Thompson, were you planning to do your shopping today? I was, she nodded, though I admit this whole situation has left me feeling a bit shaken. Keanu turned to Jake. I have an idea. What if you helped Mrs. Thompson with her shopping today? Carried her bags, maybe had a real conversation with her. I have a feeling you might learn something about each other. Jake's first instinct was to resist. The suggestion felt like a punishment, but as he looked at Martha's kind face, something shifted. Would that be okay with you, ma'am? Martha considered for a moment. Are you going to be respectful? Yes, ma'am, Jake said immediately. I promise. Then I think that would be very nice, she said with a small smile. The crowd watched in amazement as Jake offered Martha his arm for support. She accepted it with the grace of someone who understood the importance of allowing others to make amends. There's one more thing, Keanu said, reaching into his back pocket and pulling out his wallet. He extracted several bills, more than enough to cover a week's worth of groceries. Mrs. Thompson, I'd like to cover your shopping today, and maybe you could pick up a few extra things, something special for yourself. Martha's eyes filled with tears. That's too generous, dear. It's not generous, Keanu said gently. It's just what neighbors should do for each other. The lesson learned. As Martha and Jake made their way toward the store, an unlikely pair that drew curious glances from other shoppers, Keanu remained in the parking lot, surrounded by people who wanted to thank him, get pictures, or simply express their amazement at what they'd witnessed. But he deflected most of the attention, preferring to talk about Martha, about the importance of looking out for vulnerable members of the community, about how small acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways we might never know. The real hero here, he told one person who wanted to interview him, is anyone who chooses kindness when they could choose cruelty. Anyone who stands up for someone who can't defend themselves. That happens every day all around us by people whose names will never be in the news. Inside the store, something remarkable was happening. Jake, initially awkward and uncertain, found himself genuinely engaged in conversation with Martha. He learned that she'd been a teacher for 40 years, that she'd raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband died young, that she volunteered at a local literacy program despite her own limited income. Martha, in turn, discovered that Jake's aggression masked deep pain. His mother was battling cancer. His job at the garage was physically demanding and poorly paid. He'd recently ended a relationship with someone who had belittled his lack of ambition, leaving him feeling worthless and angry at the world. You know, Martha said as they waited in the checkout line, I could use some help with some repairs around my house. Nothing too complicated, but these old hands aren't what they used to be. I can't pay much, but I make a mean pot roast dinner. Jake looked at her in surprise. You'd trust me in your home, after how I acted? I think, Martha said with a wisdom that comes from decades of observing human nature, that you showed me who you really are when you chose to change. Anyone can make a mistake. Not everyone has the courage to make it right. The ripple effect. By the time they emerged from the store, Jake carrying Martha's bags and chatting easily with her about his motorcycle and her cat, a transformation had occurred that went far beyond their individual interaction. The crowd that had witnessed the initial confrontation had largely dispersed, but many had been deeply affected by what they'd seen. Several people had approached Keanu to share their own stories of times they'd failed to intervene when they should have, or times they'd been cruel when they could have been kind. One young mother, holding her 6-year-old daughter's hand, thanked him for showing her child what it looked like to stand up for others without using anger or violence. A teenage boy, who'd been recording the interaction on his phone, told Keanu he'd decided not to post it online. "Some things are too important to turn into entertainment," he said. An elderly man, about Martha's age, approached with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "We don't always feel seen, us older folks. Thank you for seeing her." Keanu was loading Martha's groceries into Jake's motorcycle saddlebags. He'd insisted on giving her a ride home, promising to drive carefully, when a reporter from a local news station arrived, having heard about the incident through social media. "The true measure of character. Mr. Reeves," the reporter called out, "can you tell us what happened here today?" Keanu finished securing the last grocery bag before turning to face the camera. "What happened here today is what should happen everywhere, every day. Someone saw another person in need and chose to help. That's not news. That's just being human." "But you're a celebrity," the reporter pressed. "Don't you think your involvement made this situation special?" Keanu shook his head gently. "The only thing that makes any situation special is when people choose compassion over indifference, kindness over cruelty. That choice is available to everyone, famous or not." He gestured toward Jake, who was helping Martha onto the back of his motorcycle, adjusting his helmet to fit her properly. "That young man made the most important choice of all. He decided to be better than his worst moment. That's the real story here." As Jake's motorcycle pulled out of the parking lot, Martha's arms wrapped securely around his waist. Several witnesses found themselves wiping away tears. They'd expected to see a rescue, but instead they'd witnessed something rarer: genuine human transformation. Keanu declined further interviews, but before getting back into his Honda Civic, he left the gathering crowd with one final thought. "We all have the power to change someone's day, for better or worse," he said. "The question is, which choice are we going to make? And are we going to make it only when people are watching, or especially when they're not?" The lasting impact. In the days that followed, the story of what happened in that parking lot spread far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. But it wasn't shared as celebrity gossip or entertainment. It was passed along as something more important. Jake kept his promise to help Martha with repairs around her house. What started as an act of penance became a genuine friendship. Martha's wisdom and Jake's practical skills proved to be a perfect combination, and her homemade meals became a weekly highlight he looked forward to. More importantly, Jake found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. The anger that had been driving his cruelty began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of purpose he'd been missing. He started volunteering at the same literacy program where Martha worked, teaching basic auto maintenance to people who couldn't afford mechanics. Martha, energized by her new friendship and the kindness shown to her that day, became something of a local activist for elderly rights. She started a support group for seniors who had experienced harassment or felt invisible in their communities. The ripple effects extended even further. Several people who had witnessed the interaction found themselves inspired to act differently in their own lives. The young mother started volunteering at a local homeless shelter with her daughter. The teenager who had chosen not to post the video began a campaign at his school about digital citizenship and the power of keeping some moments sacred. 6 months later, Keanu was back at the same shopping center, picking up some supplies for a friend's birthday party. As he walked across the parking lot, he noticed a familiar figure, Jake, helping another elderly person load groceries into their car. Jake looked up and saw him, breaking into a genuine smile. "Hey there," he called out. "How's it going?" "Going well," Keanu replied, walking over to shake hands. "How's Mrs. Thompson?" "She's great. Actually teaching me to knit, if you can believe that. Says it's good for anger management." Jake laughed. "And she's right. Who knew?" As they chatted, Jake's passenger, an elderly man with a walker, looked between them with curiosity. "Jake, aren't you going to introduce me to your friend?" "Of course," Jake said. "This is the guy I told you about, the one who helped me figure out what kind of person I wanted to be." he turned to Keanu. "This is Mr. Peterson. He's helping me understand that being strong means protecting people, not intimidating them." Keanu shook Mr. Peterson's hand warmly. "It's nice to meet you, sir." As Jake drove away with his passenger, Keanu reflected on something he'd learned long ago, but was reminded of that day. Real heroism isn't about dramatic gestures or spotlight moments. It's about the choice to see others as fully human, to respond to cruelty with wisdom rather than anger, and to believe that people can change if given the chance. Conclusion: the choice we all face. The story of what happened in that parking lot reminds us that every day we're presented with choices about who we want to be. We can choose to see others as obstacles or opportunities for kindness. We can choose to use our strength to build up or tear down. We can choose to believe that people are capable of growth or write them off as unchangeable. Martha Thompson, Jake Rodriguez, and everyone who witnessed their interaction learned something that day about the power of human connection. They learned that sometimes the most profound changes happen not through grand gestures, but through simple acts of seeing each other clearly, responding with compassion, and believing in the possibility of redemption. In a world that often feels divided, harsh, and unforgiving, their story offers something precious: hope. Hope that we can be better than our worst moments. Hope that strangers can become allies. Hope that kindness, even when it seems small, has the power to transform hearts and change lives. The question their story leaves us with is simple but profound. When we encounter someone who is struggling, someone who is vulnerable, someone who is different from us, what choice will we make? Will we add to the cruelty in the world, or will we choose to be part of the healing? The answer to that question, the answer each of us gives with our actions every single day, is what determines not just the kind of world we live in, but the kind of people we become. And perhaps most importantly, their story reminds us that true heroism is always available to us. It doesn't require fame, fortune, or special abilities. It only requires the courage to be kind when kindness is needed most, the wisdom to see past someone's worst behavior to their potential for good, and the belief that every person we meet is carrying a story that could break our hearts, if only we took the time to listen. That's a choice available to all of us, every day, in every parking lot, grocery store, and moment when we encounter another human being who could use a little kindness instead of judgment, a little understanding instead of cruelty. The only question is, what will we choose?